Session. Before starting and introducing Sister Linda, let us come together with the universal invocation. O hidden life, vibrant in every atom. O hidden light, shining in every creature. O hidden law, embracing all in oneness. May all who feel themselves as one with thee know that they are also one with every other. So welcome again to those who are joining now. We continue with our session today, and before giving the floor to Sister Linda, I would like to introduce her for those who are not familiar, though I guess all of us have at some point of our theosophical journey listened to her or met her or whatever, but I will introduce her again. So Linda Oliveira joined the Theosophical Society in 1971. She is a former international vice president of the Theosophical Society. She resided here in Adyar for a long time, for quite some years. During that time, she was the vice president of the Theosophical Society. And she was also the Australian section's national president, as well as the editor of Theosophy in Australia. During 2 periods, that means total of 16 years, she was the editor. Articles by her have been published in a number of theosophical magazines around the world. And she has also given presentations for the TS in various countries and holds a strong conviction that exploring and deeply reflecting on the perennial wisdom provides to those who are awake and alert the possibility of profound spiritual transformation. Thank you very much, Sister Linda, for joining us today, for sharing with us all your insights, knowledge, wisdom, and please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Sister Catalina. We are examining a most profound subject during this study class, the whole question of the way of the disciple and what that involves. So we will just go to the slides now, if I can be made co-host. It looks like I am.
You are co-host.
Yes. So we have been considering the qualifications for initiation. And if we look at them the way they are set out in the book, we begin with Viveka and then Vairagya. Pedro dealt with both of those yesterday. Then we come to the concept of Shat Sampati, which we will go into today. And the remaining 2 subjects will be dealt with by Pedro in the last class tomorrow. The first 4 of those are qualifications for initiation, and Miss Codd has added in a 5th section here, which includes some comments about initiation itself. So, Shat Sampati. We find this spelt differently in some different sources, but more typically in theosophical literature, we have the one word Shat Sampati spelt in this way. So today, we're going to be considering the human mind. And this is perhaps all the more significant when you consider that humanity is going through this stage of evolution now, which is marked so strongly by mental development. So anything which can help to elevate the mind, improve the mind in a spiritual sense, has to be a good thing. We can see mental development in so many ways. And so Shatsampati is a term which is often rendered as the 6 jewels of the mind. Sometimes it's called the 6 treasures of the mind. We find them mentioned, for example, in the Viveka Chudamani and the little book At the Feet of the Master, which are well-known texts. In Buddhism, Shatsampati is known as attention to conduct. Ramana Maharshi called them 6 virtues which stabilize the mind and emotions for meditation. The mental qualifications which are embraced by this term follow on from the attitude which is acquired by Viveka and Vairagya. That is the cultivation of insight on the one hand, and also a sense of balance between the pairs of opposite on the other hand. So these are very good preliminaries, Viveka and Vairagya, for these jewels of the mind which are to follow for cultivating these aspects of the mind. If we consider our life from day to day, we may say polite words, we may do some helpful thing. At the same time, though, if we are honest with ourselves, we might find that the mind is relatively uncontrolled. So from time to time, it's very useful to pause and to watch our thoughts. We may realize directly that the mind needs to be brought back to a more aware state, which reflects this spiritual discernment and this equilibrium, this balance between the pairs of opposites. For example, our mental state may become irritated as a result of the behavior of a particular person. The mind may even be directing negative thoughts towards that individual. But if we are aware, we can be helpful instead by immediately replacing such negativity whenever it occurs with a positive and uplifting thought for the other individual. These teachings that we are considering in these classes need to be made intensely practical. And the whole thread of awareness, of attention really runs through them. We need to be attentive to what is going on, to what our responses are, to the many things we are experiencing around us. The mind can really begin to shine when these jewels are polished, as it were, when they are made more perfect. They can make a profound difference, in fact, to the way in which we live. So let us begin with an overview with Miss Codd's equivalent English terms. We have the Sanskrit on the left, and then we have the English equivalents as she likes to express them. So we have Shama, or mental control, Dhamma, the resulting control of action, that action which is naturally controlled when the mind is controlled, Operati, or letting people be what they are, Titiksha, letting events be what they are, Samadhana, or wholeheartedness, and Shraddha, or faith. So these are what we're going to be considering this afternoon. To begin with, Shama, or mental control. It's also been described as suppression of manas, suppression of the mind principle, tranquility, peace of mind, contentment. I think we can get the general idea easily enough. So really, when we think about it, it's remarkably difficult to achieve this peace of mind. It may be there for a little while, but then it disappears for some reason. Probably most of us have very busy lives with numerous things to deal with. There may be relationships to contend with, there may be family problems, all sorts of things come up in life. The news brings all sorts of events about the world into our lives as well. So our mental world is typically filled with all sorts of input from the senses relating to everyday life, and we find ourselves very naturally looking for peace in some way. The fact is, we can create certain external conditions for this, such as a quiet place to meditate regularly. But the question is, are we actually willing to change the habit patterns of many lifetimes? Are we willing to change? For one thing, it's necessary to change the mind's way of functioning from a relatively distracted state to a state of greater focus and attention. The fact is that the qualifications for initiation are really quite demanding. And as we go through them in this session, we may find aspects of them which are developed in us to some extent. And yet we may also find that considerably more unfoldment needs to take place. Miss Codd mentions that Sri Shankaracharya describes Shama as the undisturbed concentration of the mind upon an object of perception, not allowing the mind to engage in any other kind of thought than listening to what the sages say about the spirit to the teachings, listening to the teachings, or shravana, reflecting upon this, manana, or meditating upon this, upon the teachings, really, nididhyasana. So we have hearing, reflecting, deep meditation. Hearing, reflecting, deep meditation. And this really needs to become a way of life for the disciple. They are 3 stages of practice which really do help to elevate, to deepen the consciousness. And this is to become an actual way of life, not something which is practiced occasionally. So immediately we see the seriousness of this. It's a certain kind of life when one becomes steeped in spiritual teachings. The text also mentions Patanjali's 3 preliminaries to real yoga. Firstly, whole-souled and ardent self-training, or we could call this self-reliance. Secondly, deep thought and study. We could call this self-inquiry. And then also absolute devotion to the Supreme, making him the motive for all action. So maybe we can think of this as devotional service. So we're reminded that Patanjali described all thought processes as vrittis, which can also be described as vibrations or wavelengths, and that yoga or union with the Oversoul is achieved by control of these vibrations and finally by their total cessation. Then the mind becomes like a still lake and we stand in our own true nature, knowing ourselves as we really are. That's when we come to know ourselves, when the mind is really silent, really quiet. Something wells up from within the consciousness. So images, once again, are very useful as a way of understanding ourselves. And when we think of the mind as being like a still lake or a still body of water, we get a certain feeling, a certain impression of great tranquility. Another image in the text is an interesting one. Clara Codd says, if we are going with the traffic on the road, we are not aware of the pace. We are not aware of how fast the traffic is traveling. But if we stand still, she said, the traffic can be seen to be rushing at great speed. And you will have seen this, standing beside the road and seeing the traffic rush past. And then she says, our minds can be understood in this way as being full of traffic. And I couldn't get a picture of someone beside a busy road, but equally, when we allow thought to subside, it's as though we are above and beyond the traffic. So we get this different kind of state of being. There is this movement, but that becomes further and further away the more we disappear into our interior, if we want to put it that way. We need to understand that most of our states of mind are evoked, as Miss Codd mentions, by emotional attachments. Most of our states of mind are evoked by emotional attachments. Hence, the potency of that practice of viveka or discernment and vairagya, that balance, a kind of steadiness. In the Bhagavad Gita, after Arjuna tells Lord Krishna that he deems his mind as hard to curb as the wind, the reply is that it can be done by constant practice and by dispassion, by abhyasa and vairagya. The mind can be controlled by constant practice and dispassion. And this is what we need to be prepared to do, to consistently practice this, to consistently watch the mind, to be aware of it. And once we become aware of it, then it's easier to know what we really need to do. So now we come to the second jewel of the mind, Dharma, the resulting control of action. The way action becomes more controlled when the mind is more controlled in the first place. When the mind possesses greater equanimity and naturally turns more towards the divine, then actions start to take on that very special quality of reverence. It's a different kind of order of action. And this is evident in some of the descriptions of Dharma, which we find mentioned in the text. So once again, Miss Codd usefully draws from different traditions to show us different ways of looking at the concept. We begin with Sri Shankaracharya. Restraining the 5 organs of perception and the 5 organs of action from all things other than as instruments of the Supreme. So making our organs of perception and action instruments of the Supreme. It's really dedicating one's life to something higher. In the Buddhist tradition, she talked about Dharma as being purity in action and in words. in the Bhagavad Gita. Whatsoever thou doest, whatsoever thou eatest, whatsoever thou offerest, whatsoever thou givest, whatsoever thou dost of austerity, do thou that as an offering unto me. It's really quite beautiful. Those words are lovely. Whatever we do it as an offering to the Supreme, if you like, the Krishna within each of us. Then we had the Master KH, who spoke of taking on no new worldly duties, doing all for his sake. So not doing things for ourselves, but doing them for a higher purpose, which is really quite lovely. And then she also quotes from an English religious poet and hymn writer called Frances Havergal. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. So consecrating one's life to God, if you like. So these are all ways of considering Dharma, and we get this great sense of the sacred here, making our actions sacred, and that's really an important component of this. She talks about physical action and makes the point that if the mind is controlled, then it is specifically identified with this physical body. And in that case, our densest physical body is used and treated well. It's not misused. So a controlled mind leads to control of the body as well. She then talks about all action on the part of the disciple to be perfectly performed. HPB spoke of fixing all of one's attention on what one is doing, fixing the whole of one's attention. I'm reminded here of working alongside Radhaji while I was at Adyar, and I couldn't help but notice when I would go into her office, as I had to do quite often, how she worked, how she worked with some sort of paperwork in front of her. She was really wholeheartedly focused on whatever she was doing. And this was one of the strong characteristics about her, the care she took with things that she had to do, no matter how apparently mundane in terms of administration. She took care, and maybe some of that is missing in this day and age, but there's a lot to be said for taking care, for paying attention to what we are doing. We then read a little bit about speech. Miss Codd talks about the old proverb about counting to 10 before we speak. There was often quite a lot of wisdom in some of these old proverbs. By counting to 10 before we speak, it causes us to pause and consider, is what I'm going to say really true and kind and helpful? To pick up one of the thoughts from the little book At the Feet of the Master. At least to pause a little before speaking. How often do we just talk so spontaneously that we speak in a careless way and perhaps even hurt somebody else? Words bring results on the physical plane. Their motive works on the inner planes. But words are often so coloured with some kind of emotion, and we come back to this question of emotions and thoughts being related. And this originates in karma manas. The concept of duty is another important one. If there are obligations, then they are also to be fulfilled rather perfectly by the disciple. And we need to remember we're speaking here about a fully fledged disciple of a master in this section, and therefore the aims are high ones. It's not a question of just managing to do everything, but whatever one does to turn one's attention to it and give it one's best. And it talks about, let's go back a little there, an individual who throws aside a single responsibility cannot be a disciple. So the question of responsibility is an important one. It is mentioned in the book that when the hour is ripe, karma often breaks a certain chain of events. You may have found this in your own life. A certain situation goes on for a long time, but suddenly things change, doors open up, and sometimes there can be a complete change in one's life. And that is when that hour is ripe. Karma has been exhausted in one area and one moves on to something else. One door closes and another door opens. A very inspiring statement is made about Dharma, this control of action. And that is, ordinary events in the life of the aspirant, says Clara, take on a divine complexion. Ordinary events take on a divine complexion. How often does one do something and it seems to be drudgery, it seems to be boring, it seems to be unimportant, seems to be mundane? Everything has significance in this kind of life, everything that one does. Life's events, even small ones, become full of meaning. HPB mentioned that in the life of the disciple, there are no insignificant events, and sometimes the most trivial ones are the most full of meaning. One may be looking for large and apparently important things to happen, but there is importance even in the small things in life. And then on action in relationships. When we think about action, it has various types of manifestations, including in relationships. And the Master KH said to the young Krishnaji, firm as a rock where right and wrong are concerned, yield always to others in things which do not matter. So to know when to stand firm, when it's a question of right or wrong, and when to give a bit, yield to another, is part of the art of learning relationship. The Master KH said to a chela on probation, the greatest consolation in and the foremost duty of life, child, is not to give pain and to avoid causing suffering to man or beast. So not to give pain and to avoid causing suffering. And these are practical and very important points that are coming out here. The fact is that the mind affects our actions all the time, of course. We read in the book, serene, large, lovely thoughts. Surely they will result in beautiful action, which is calm and unhurried. So this brings up the whole question of what kind of thoughts do we think? If we, I guess, focus on things which are more elevating whenever we are not otherwise engaged, and think, I guess, thoughts which are directed towards the divine, then that will also affect our actions very much. and they will become less hurried and more calm. Very good practical advice. Now we come to the third jewel of the mind, Operati, which Clara Codd summarizes as letting people be what they are. Letting people be what they are. Again, she draws from several sources. Sri Shankaracharya, a condition that does not depend upon the external worlds. So this is an internal condition. In Buddhism, ceasing from all bigotry and superstition. And bigotry is having unreasonable beliefs and disliking or judging others who don't share our beliefs. It's a very strong kind of prejudice, really. So to cease from bigotry and to cease from superstition. For Annie Besant, Operati was to be rooted in unity, to accept all as they are, without approving or condemning, learning not to judge. And that's not necessarily so easy. We may see people around us. We don't understand why they act in the way that they do. And it's very tempting to label them, to judge them, to really push them away as a result. And this is not coming from a center of unity. It's coming from the tendency of the mind all too easily to divide, to separate me from others. Miss Codd said tolerance can be misunderstood because sometimes it's called tolerance or translated as tolerance. But she said tolerance may only be a contemptuous indifference to another, just barely putting up with another person. Instead, she prefers Operati to be thought of as letting people be what they are. And the reasoning for this is clear enough. It goes further than tolerance. It's a complete acceptance of others as they are. She acknowledges how difficult this is for people who ache to reform others, to alter others, because they think they know what is best for another person. They may then become very indignant if their recommendations are not followed. Have you ever found yourself trying to impose your will on another? It's probably something that most of us do at times during our life. And this can be an especially difficult balancing act for parents as their children grow older, letting them become themselves with less general guidance, guiding but not trying to control. There's a real art to that. And as she mentioned, Operati is a spiritual power which belongs to every adept, being the ability to put oneself in the place of another, to see as he sees, to actually imagine oneself in another's place, to try to understand better. In this respect, I'd like to share with you a few verses of a poem from Mary T. Lathrop, who lived in the 19th century, and the poem was called Judge Softly or Walk a Mile in His Moccasins. Moccasins are a kind of shoe. So she was an American poet. She was even a preacher. She was, like Clara Codd, a suffragette. And I couldn't help but think of this poem when coming to this particular topic. So I've selected 3 verses from the poem to share with you. Pray Don't find fault with the man that limps or stumbles along the road, unless you have worn the moccasins, that is, the shoes he wears, or stumbled beneath the same load. Don't be too harsh with the man that sins, or pelt him with words or stone or disdain, unless you are sure you have no sins of your own, and it's only wisdom and love that your heart contains. Just walk a mile in his moccasins before you abuse, criticize, and accuse. If just for 1 hour you could find a way to see through his eyes instead of your own muse. It's really something that speaks to the heart, to really exhorts us not to be too harsh on others, to try to understand them. And especially unless we're sure that we have no sins of our own. So, we need to look at ourselves before we really start judging others and criticizing and all of that. The text points out that whether we see the best or the worst in everyone is really a question of state of mind or habit of mind. Many people have the habit of seeing the worst in others, and yet Miss Codd was of the view that even the worst person still has something good and beautiful in them, such as a murderer who she knew, who had a little daughter whom he adored. So she was advocating to let people be as they are, for it is rarely our business, she said, to interfere. In the Buddhist scriptures, Operati is regarded as cessation from bigotry and superstition, which has been mentioned. And I think it's important to think about this really for ourselves. But also we read of bigotry, this kind of really prejudicial attitude towards another person or group, as showing up as hardened spots in the mental aura, which literally hinder the flow of divine energy into us. When we put up these barriers, when there are hardened spots, a hard shell around us, the divine energy cannot flow through us. Furthermore, and perhaps even more challenging, Miss Codd writes that no occultist is bound by any particular religion, any particular religious belief or ceremony, but is prepared to use ceremony as a scientific method of providing atmosphere and obtaining the invisible aid of the Deva or angel kingdom. So it's a question of attitude. How does one approach religious beliefs or ceremonies? So now we move on from Operati, or letting people be as they are, to Titiksha, which she translates as letting events be what they are. Again, a number of different perspectives. Sri Shankaracharya spoke of this as endurance of all pain and sorrow without thought of retaliation, rejection, or lamentation. Endurance of all pain and sorrow with a certain attitude of mind. In Buddhism, forbearance, that's that kind of patient self-control. And then you have the Master KH, who spoke of cheerful willingness to part with everything or anything which karma may take from us. And that's not so easy either, because we all form attachments to things, and sometimes we have to part with them. Can we cheerfully part with them? I always remember many years ago, Mary Anderson, who was at one time International Vice President of the Society. describing how she had been called to Adyar to give service. She lived in Switzerland and had to get rid of her furniture. She said she stood in her little flat looking down on the street below while a big machine basically broke up all of her furniture and took it away. She could not take it to India and she had to dispose of it. And she seemed quite cheerful when she recounted this story. She was ready to let that go and move on to the next phase of her life. Then we have HPB, who spoke of supreme indifference to what is called pleasure or pain. This is not easy. We feel pleasure and pain quite regularly. We have desires and we have aversions to things, but to actually be indifferent to these things requires a state of tremendous inner equilibrium. For Annie Besant, we had quiet strength which can bear all shocks, all delays. This quiet strength, no matter what is happening. In The Voice of the Silence, we read, have patience, candidate, as one who fears no failure, courts no success. Then St. Catherine of Siena, patience, she thought, was the greatest lesson of all others. She called it the touchstone of God. And patience is a tremendous lesson to learn. Perhaps it's easier to do as one becomes a bit older, but it's something that needs to be worked on. Clara Codd prefers to call this titiksha as letting events be what they are, or steadiness under all conditions. And in the book, she notes that it's easy to see that such an attitude of mind is largely the result of this practice of viveka and vairagya, discrimination and balance between the opposites, steadiness under all conditions. This quality has also been described as endurance, but endurance can mean just barely putting up with something, but letting events be what they are implies indeed a complete acceptance of them. She then writes something on the nature of pain, and I think it's obvious as we go through this course that this book covers many areas. It's an intensely interesting book, actually, and worthwhile reading through if you have not already done so. As mentioned before, we have chosen specific aspects of the sections to bring out in the classes, but there is more there as well, and it's worthwhile just considering and turning over in one's mind. So the question of pain, we read that disobedience to the laws of nature is pain. Clara Codd regarded pain as remedial. It's something which can remedy something within us if we are open to learn. Therefore, it holds the potential for us to correct an imbalance within ourselves if we are sufficiently aware. HPB called pain the teacher, the awakener of consciousness. So pain actually has a very significant role in life if we allow it to do that. And there's real truth in this, that it can awaken consciousness. It's perfectly possible to change and become a force for good in the wake of pain. To give an example, there was an Australian woman called Rosie Batty. A number of years ago, she lost her son because of domestic violence, which is almost unimaginable in terms of what she went through. But then she decided she was going to campaign against domestic violence. she raised the awareness of that in the community. She became the Australian of the Year one year, and later went on to receive, to be made an Officer of the Order of Australia, which is a very high honour. So that pain, in a sense, awakened in her consciousness the fact that she could actually do something to perhaps make the world a better place for others, raise awareness about this problem, and how it might be alleviated to some extent. And then you have this wonderful statement from Annie Besant to Clara Codd. When I look back over a long life, I would now willingly surrender all my joys, but not one of my sorrows, because I learnt the most from them. She said she learnt more from her sorrows than anything else in her life. Gives us something to think about. Now, in this section on Titiksha, there's also some related discussion on the operation of the law of karma, and the fact that we have 3 types of karma in the Indian tradition: Kriyamana karma, the product of our actions in the current life, also called agami karma, prarabdha karma, that's our past karma, which has ripened and is due to be expressed in the present life, and sanchita karma, which has been accumulated by our long past. It's gradually worked out in successive lives, but held up more fully until the ego is strong enough to learn from them. It would overwhelm the immature soul and tends to be, or is, delayed until the soul is strong enough not to be crushed, but rather to be purified by it. And we read that it's when attention is turned towards the path of adeptship that the full force of the past has to be liquidated, to be set free. And the lords of karma, as they are referred to, send more of one's past to rectify. And I want to bring up again this image of an eggshell. You might recall that from a previous class, really, in relation to this sanchita karma. So this is held up until we are basically strong enough to learn from it. And once the chick has reached a certain stage, then it can break through the shell and face certain things. And I guess it's a bit like this with sanchita karma as well. Then there's a little bit of mention, before we go on to the next quality, of the importance of small things, the importance of small things in life. Bearing in mind the workings of karma all the time in our lives, we become more aware that everything that we think, everything that we do, everything that we say has significance and meaning. How we do things says a great deal about us, and this becomes even more significant for the disciple. And this is something that we can really take to heart. Small things. How do we do small things in life? Often we make mistakes. We might drop something, we might break something, but we can always resolve to do it a bit differently in the future. We're also aware, I think, that there are certain things that we can change in life and other things that we can't change. And this is when we see the hand of karma quite definitely. There is a situation that is put before us. We cannot change it. We just have to find a way of dealing with it. And sometimes only after certain circumstances in our lives have been completed is it possible for us to move on to the next phase of an incarnation. So, titiksha. We now move on to the next jewel of the mind, samadhana, translated here as wholeness, or perhaps we can think of it as balance as well. For Sri Shankaracharya, it was the constant fixing of the mind on pure spirit, that fixing of the mind in a certain direction on pure spirit. For the Lord Buddha, intentness. In Christianity, an example was given from Matthew in the Holy Bible. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. So it's as though if we are wholehearted about what we are doing, and dedicating it to the divine, then there'll be a kind of a blessing upon us, if you like, represented by this idea that we shall be full of light. The Master KH referred to wholeness as one-pointedness. For HPB, we had the pupil must make all his desires center upon the acquirement of spiritual knowledge, so that the whole tendency of his nature is in that direction. And then Ramana Maharshi, focus or concentration on pursuance of the goal. So we see how the mind needs to be used in a specific way for real mental evolution to occur. There needs to be much more a sense of the divine, much more a sense of wholeness, much more a sense of acceptance of the law, accepting things as they are, accepting others as they are as well. Understanding that we are put in certain situations and that we're brought into contact with certain people for a reason. And really, it's appropriate to try to use such contacts to be helpful or kind in some way whenever there is a need to do so. Text mentions that the marshalling of all our forces produces great karmic results. Ambition, when it's directed heavenwards, is not so much the desire to possess or achieve or to arrive, as the opening of the soul to the dimly felt loveliness and truth. So not wanting to achieve, it's a different kind of ambition. It's just opening up the soul to something which we feel dimly inside, perhaps. Miss Codd mentions that in the life of the wholly dedicated individual, events happen quickly and clearly and with increased power. So the more dedicated one is, the more one may see certain effects. We read that many people get upset about small worries and losses in everyday life. But for one who is really spiritually dedicated, he or she becomes philosophical about such things. So let us remember, especially in the early days of discipleship, that environment and events do not matter, because the path is a matter of an attitude of mind, not of outward circumstances. The aspirant lives life like anyone else, with the same duties and the circumstances, but the attitude towards them is different. There's this fundamental shift in inner attitude, because that individual's life is wholly dedicated to the master and to life, which Clara says is God. and all duties are personally and perfectly fulfilled. So the bar is set high. At the end of this particular section on Samadhana or wholeness, she quotes from the Flemish mystic Jan Ruysbroek in The Adornment of the Spiritual Marriage. And the first verse which she mentions goes like this: every good deed, however small, if it be directed to God by simplicity of intention, increases in us the divine likeness and deepens in us the flow of eternal life. Which is rather lovely. Every good deed that we do, even if it's very small, if it's in the right direction, makes us more divine and deepens within us the flow of eternal life. That is not necessarily the reason why we do something, but it's kind of a byproduct of that, which is quite a positive and optimistic way of looking at it. Then we come to Shraddha or faith, the sixth jewel of the mind. We have again several points of view. Sri Shankaracharya, intensely strong faith in the teachings and in the Guru, Shraddha. In Buddhism, faith. For the Master KH, confidence, truth in the Master and in ourselves. The point is made that faith is not dogmatic assertion of any belief. It doesn't mean that we believe or that we trust too easily. It's not this kind of blind belief. And that the Master does not base faith on blind credulity, on just being gullible, believing anything that comes along. And indeed, those who were behind the formation of the TS wanted people to learn to think for themselves too. Miss Codd mentions that the one thing alone to which we should be absolutely faithful is the voice of our own divinity, that unlearned knowledge, which is the fiat, meaning the will or the dictate of our deeper selves. That's what we need to be faithful to, the voice of our own divinity. But in order to hear that voice, she said, we must uncover many layers of prejudice, dogmatic beliefs, and traditional formulas. For Ramana Maharshi, faith was an intense sense of certainty about one's path. We also read of the ideal being complete acceptance of the law and our situation in life, especially during difficult periods. There's a well-known quote which is given from the little book, Light on the Path. Listen to the song of life. And then there was an additional note to that verse, which included the words, at the very base of your nature, you will find faith, hope, and love. Really quite lovely. And maybe there has been a great challenge in the life of many of us. And at moments like that, all we have left to lean on, as it were, is a certain faith, certain hope in the future. And even we might find love there as well. So this is really quite profound, that faith exists at the very base of our nature. Clara Codd said that to understand humanity and the souls of others is the primary aim, not to gain uncommon knowledge or spiritual stature for oneself. To understand humanity and the souls of others. And then she quoted this French saying, which says, to understand all is to forgive all. And it's true enough that when we really understand something, then there may have previously been some resistance, some resentment, some lack of forgiveness. But if we really understand, then it is possible to forgive. Annie Besant will come to a summary in the moment of this session too, but there's a quote from her here. Never forget that life can only be nobly inspired and rightly lived if you take it bravely and gallantly as a splendid adventure in which you're setting out into an unknown country to face many a danger, to meet many a joy, to find many a comrade, to win and lose many a battle. And I guess that really was a typical comment from her, really, that life could be seen in this way as a splendid adventure. And goodness knows she went through her challenges. She went through her difficulties. And yet she had this kind of pioneering spirit, I suppose, at the same time. So we come to the end of this section concerning the 6 virtues or treasures or jewels of the mind. And just to review them briefly, we've looked at mental control, resulting control of action, letting people be what they are, letting events be what they are, wholeheartedness and faith. So in the next and final session, Pedro is going to be considering the last 2 sections in the section on discipleship in this book, Mumukshudva, and also a bit about some notes about initiation itself, written by Miss Codd. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sister Linda, for giving such inspiration to us for living and understanding better this adventure in which we are participating every day of life. Thank you really very much. We appreciate your words. You have given us a lot of food for our thoughts and a lot of things to ponder upon, to reflect upon. So now I welcome any question or comment from the participants that is there, whether in the chat or you can just unmute yourselves, please. Okay, there is a comment here in the chat from Chandria Prabhabuyan. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your insightful explanation.
Thank you. There's actually various questions come up when we go through this material. And one thing which we could even consider for a few moments is, why is it that mental control is difficult? That first jewel of the mind is about mental control, Shama. But why is it hard to control the mind? And I don't know whether anybody here today has any particular thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's really something that we should ponder upon, and yeah, it's like a daily task that we have to undertake, this mental control.
Namaskar.
Sorry?
I'm Kanchan. I said hello.
Oh,
Good
okay.
morning.
Good morning, Namaskar.
I'm Kanchan from IP Lodge, Delhi, India.
Hello.
You raised a question why it is difficult. Yes. have I understood the question correctly? Why it is difficult to control the mind?
Yes.
Yes. Firstly, we are never focused. Our mind is wandering, pondering. We are more busy with the others' affairs and rather living in the present, doing the present work. See, the most difficult thing is to quieten the mind. As in the Bhagavad Gita also they say, what travels the fastest in the world is the mind. And to rein those horses of your thought, first you have to understand yourself. Go deep, not introvert, go inside. Experiencing these days.
Thank you. Yes, it's true enough that the mind is outward turned so much of the time. And yes, many other people may attract our attention, and we may have a lot of interest in others and perhaps become too interested in others and not prepared to look inside ourselves and just learn to become quiet more.
You want to see her?
I think by the
Somebody else had something to say?
Could I venture to suggest to your question, or why is it so difficult to control the mind? I suggest what the theosophical content indicates, that the mind is affected, the mind is split in two, yes, the higher mind and the lower mind, and the lower mind is affected by emotions. So the emotions are clouding the clear perception of the higher mind. That's my contribution to your
Yes.
question.
And those emotions are drawn so much from our desire nature as well, things that we like and things that we don't like. And that can affect us quite profoundly. It can affect the whole quality of our thought. It can make the mind incredibly restless. So that, as Krishna said to Arjuna, abhyasa and vairagya, regular practice and this kind of detachment need to be practiced again and again and again. It's not something that we can deal with all of a sudden, but it requires dedication. It requires commitment. And that's really that starting point, that cornerstone of Shatsampati, that cornerstone of these jewels of the mind is beginning by learning to steady the mind, learning to control the mind.
I would like to come to that picture which is shown on the Bhagavad Gita on the cover. There are 5 horses of white horses, and the reins are the king of the mind. So the 5 senses that we have, hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, and touching, those 5 senses are to be controlled, which are in the hands of Krishna, holding those 5 reins. So if you can control your senses, 5 senses, then it will be easier to control your mind.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. And then again, that's another one of those wonderful images, which is very rich, and it can help us to understand things using not just words, but some kind of visual image. Thank you for that.
May I butt in a second time?
Yes.
I think that we got a relevant quote from HPB from her book, The Voice of Silence, which says, and it's relevant to the question of how to tame our mind. He says the well-known verses, the mind is the great slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer. It's very poetically put forward, but there is rationality into this. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Yeah, it's all about.
If people don't have, sorry.
Well, it's all about bringing a certain quality to the mind.
Yes, Brother Jitendra, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I would just say that if those people don't have the Clara Coates book, they can read this one, which is exactly, the path of the disciple by Annie Besant. All that Linda said today, they are appearing in this book. Operati, faith, Shraddha, all those words are appearing also in this one. The way of the disciple and the path of the disciple.
Thank you.
Well, I guess we have come to the end of our session. Thank you, everyone, for your questions, your insights, your sharing, and especially to Sister Linda for this wonderful and inspiring session. Professor Shinde, you want to add something before we close?
Yeah,
Okay.
I want to thank Linda ji, because we are sitting in the EST office, Priya and Dr. Revati, Geeta. Actually, they want to wish you, but just now they have left. So one thing, Linda ji, I want to share here that the control of mind is really difficult. That is experience of everyone. That is what it discussed now. But our aim is quietening the mind. Mind has been conditioned from million years ago. That is what Krishnamurti usually puts it. It is conditioned, and therefore it is difficult to control. It is habituated. It is conditioned to think in a particular way, and therefore it is very difficult to control. It needs to be quietened, and the silence purifies. So one is directed towards the silence, and the ending of thought is the solution, because mind being the factory of the thought, ending of the thought is the solution, he said. So mind is the slayer of the real, slay the slayer. That is what HPB said. The same thing here we discussed. Very nice discussion also, and your explanations are very deep and inspiring. Thank you, Linda ji, for
Thank you,
such a
Professor Shinde.
wonderful talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you,
With your
Professor
permission.
Shinde. And Brother Mahapatra, do you want to add something before closing?
No, thanks.
Okay. Okay, so
With your-
see you to, sorry?
With your permission, can I add one sentence?
Oh yeah, please. Yeah.
We are talking of mind. Now, my personal practical experience I would like to share. There is a sentence by Leadbeater: thought becomes things. Select the good ones. Now, mind is the most obedient servant of mind. Whatever I think, mind will do. If I say mind is very difficult to control, mind will say, yes, it is very difficult to control me. But if you say, mind is my most obedient servant, he will obey to me. And mind will say, yes, sir, I am your obedient servant. It is my own self that I'm not able to control my mind. And when the moment you say, if he can do it, I can do it, mind will say, yes, I'll make sure that you do it. Thank you.
Thank you. A nice note of optimism to finish on.
Yes, good.
Wanted
Okay.
to give a small story on Shraddha, faith. It's a very good small story. In Ireland, the Irish farmers were suffering because there was no rains for 2-3 years. So the priest said, come to the church this Sunday, and I can guarantee you, if you have the faith, there'll be rain on Monday morning. Please come on Sunday. And they sat down, they had a prayers for 6 hours. And then they opened the door. It was early morning, Monday morning, past midnight. So they said, priest, the rain hasn't come. You said there'll be rain. Now it hasn't come. But he says, how many of you have come with raincoats and umbrella and gumboots and everything? That you knew that there will be the rain, but did you prepare for the raincoats and the umbrella and the gumboots and so that? But none of you were ready. How could the rain come? You didn't have faith. If you had faith, you would have come with them.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again to everyone, to Sister Linda, and see you tomorrow at the same time for the last session of this study class with Brother Pedro. Have a great day ahead and namaste.
Thank you. Thank you.